You won't believe what a woman found on the ceiling of her kitchen. Millions of eggs, a strange smell, and a ceiling ready to burst at any moment. Watch until the end to find out what happened, and subscribe so you don't miss our next stories. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and share this video with your friends. The first weeks after the move felt almost unreal to Vanessa. She had spent years craving stillness, craving a space that belonged only to her, and now it finally existed. The new apartment was small but bright, tucked into an aging brick building that sat at the end of a narrow street lined with maples. When she first stepped inside, she had been struck by the smell. Faint detergent, new paint, and something older underneath like damp plaster and dust that refused to die. Still, it was hers. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't have to share the air with another person. The quiet was absolute. Every morning began the same way. Vanessa rose before her alarm. The habit of early shifts at the clinic still burned into her nerves. She made coffee, washed the single mug she used, and turned on the small radio by the window. The local station played soft jazz or news she didn't really hear, but it filled the room just enough to keep her from feeling alone. Her kitchen, freshly renovated by the previous owner, was her favorite place. The counters gleamed, the sink was spotless, and above her head stretched a smooth white ceiling, the modern kind, glossy and seamless. It reflected light like a frozen pond. That morning was no different, except for the light. The sun came from an odd angle, slanting through the narrow window and scattering across the cabinets. When she reached for the sugar, her eyes caught something peculiar. The reflection on the ceiling wasn't flat anymore. The light curved, slightly distorted, as though the surface had sagged inward. At first, she thought it was a trick of her tired eyes. She blinked, moved to another spot, looked again. The illusion remained. A faint hollow shape, subtle but undeniable, hovered above the middle of the kitchen. She stood there for a while, cup in hand, trying to decide whether to care. The apartment had been empty for years before she bought it. The building itself was nearly 70 years old. Old pipes, old walls, maybe it was normal. She touched the wall near the door. It was cool but dry. The ceiling showed no stain, no discoloration, only that soft dip, like the start of a bruise beneath white skin. Vanessa shrugged it off and went about her day. She worked from home now, entering data for a medical supplier. The job required precision and little else. Her life had folded into a routine she found comforting: coffee, work, a walk in the park before sunset, dinner alone. Order and quiet had become her medicine. The ceiling, she told herself, could wait. That night, though, as she brushed her teeth, she noticed it again. The reflection of the overhead light wavered slightly when she looked through the doorway into the kitchen. A curve where there should have been a line. She took her phone, snapped a picture, and zoomed in. The camera lens emphasized the dip. It was there. A few centimeters maybe, no more. She frowned, saved the image, and made a mental note. Call maintenance tomorrow. The next morning, the dip seemed deeper. She couldn't be sure. Maybe the light was harsher. Maybe she was obsessing. She took another photo from the same spot and compared them. The line of the cabinets in the background gave her scale. The difference was small but real. A mild sense of unease crept up her spine. Something was pressing from above. Her mind began to sift through possibilities. Water leak, she thought first. The neighbor upstairs, an old man she'd met only once, could have a broken pipe, a dripping sink. She'd heard no sound of running water, though, no footsteps, Nothing but the normal hush of the building. The silence, once comforting, now felt thick, as if the walls themselves were listening. By noon, she couldn't resist checking. She brought the small folding stepladder from the hall closet and climbed up, careful to keep her balance. The surface of the ceiling was cool under her fingertips, not wet, but oddly pliant, like a drum stretched too loosely. It yielded just slightly when she pressed. The sensation made her stomach twist. She drew her hand back immediately. A drop of cold sweat slid down her back, though the apartment wasn't warm. She spent the next hour pacing. Her rational mind whispered explanations: condensation, bad installation, some harmless quirk of the new material. But another part of her, the one that still remembered her grandmother's house in Georgia, with its swollen walls and the stench of mold after summer storms, refused to rest. She could almost smell that same faint earthiness now, even if it was just memory bleeding into air. Finally, she opened her laptop and searched for the building's maintenance contact. The management company's website looked like it hadn't been updated in years. She found a number, called, and waited through a robotic menu. A recorded voice promised, "Your request will be processed within 48 hours. She left a message describing the issue: ceiling sagging, possible leak, kitchen area, and hung up. There was nothing else to do. The rest of the afternoon she tried to work but kept glancing toward the kitchen. Every time she entered, the curve seemed deeper, as if the ceiling were slowly inhaling. The glossy surface caught the light differently now. It had lost its mirror sheen. She could see faint ripples when she moved her head, like waves frozen mid-motion. At dinner, she ate standing by the window, avoiding the center of the room. The dip drew her eyes no matter where she looked. It wasn't big enough to justify panic, but it filled her with a nervous anticipation, like waiting for a noise in the dark. Before bed, she measured the depth using a thread and a small piece of tape. She marked it at the edge of a cabinet and wrote the date beside it. She told herself it was only for curiosity's sake. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Old buildings were supposed to creak, pipes were supposed to groan. This one didn't. Around midnight, as she sat reading, she heard a faint sound, a single, soft click from the kitchen. It wasn't loud, but in that stillness it carried. She froze, listening. Nothing followed. Her heart beat harder than it should have. She forced a laugh at herself, set the book aside, and turned off the lights. Lying in bed, she imagined water gathering above her ceiling, inch by inch, pressing downward. She imagined the fragile film separating her from whatever lay inside. She thought about the silence between her and the upstairs apartment, how she'd never heard a single flush or footstep. Maybe he wasn't even home. Maybe the apartment above was empty. The following morning, she walked straight to the kitchen before even turning on the coffee maker. The thread mark told her the truth. The dip had grown by at least a centimeter overnight. There was no mistaking it now. A shallow bowl hung over her kitchen table, perfect and smooth, like something heavy trying to push its way through. She stared at it for a long time, her pulse steadying not from calm, but from resignation. She took another picture and sent it through the building's maintenance portal with a short note. "It's getting worse." Then she sat down at the table and drank her coffee under the bulging white ceiling, watching how the morning light bent around its curve. There was a point, she realized, where quiet stopped being peaceful and became something else entirely. It became waiting. And she didn't know yet what she was waiting for, only that whatever was above her head was no longer still. Vanessa woke to a muffled creak, like something stretching above her. It wasn't loud enough to jolt her upright, but it was there. threading through the quiet like a slow exhale. For a few seconds she lay still, unsure whether the sound had come from her dream or her ceiling. When she finally stepped into the kitchen, the answer was waiting. The sag had deepened. The elegant white panel no longer looked like a smooth modern feature. It resembled a pregnant curve of plastic, bulging low enough now that it caught the reflection of the morning light in a warped oval. The sight pulled at something instinctive in her, an unease she couldn't reason away. She set her coffee mug aside and stood beneath the swollen shape, tilting her head. It didn't just look lower, it seemed alive in a way that disturbed her. The glossy surface quivered faintly when she moved, as if sensitive to air currents, or perhaps it was her imagination, shaped by anxiety and lack of sleep. She reached up again, hesitating a second before her fingertips made contact. The ceiling felt taut and unnaturally cool, not soft like water inside a balloon, but firm, as though it held something thicker beneath it. Her touch sent a tremor through her hand. She withdrew quickly, wiping her palm against her robe as if she had touched something unclean. She went to her laptop and pulled up the maintenance portal again. The message she'd sent yesterday still showed pending. She dialed the number listed below, waiting through the mechanical voice. For urgent leaks, press 2. She pressed it. The line clicked and a man finally answered, his tone half asleep, half irritated. She explained the situation as calmly as she could, emphasizing the words expanding, sagging, and possible leak. He asked perfunctorily if water was dripping. When she said no, there was silence on the other end, followed by a sigh. "Then it's not an emergency, ma'am. We'll have someone check it tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word lodged somewhere in her chest. She thanked him anyway and hung up, though politeness felt like a betrayal of her own instincts. She wanted to insist that something was wrong, that it wasn't just water, but the part of her that had always hated being the difficult tenant, the fussy woman, kept her quiet. She poured coffee and tried to drink it at her desk, but she could still see the curve from the corner of her eye through the doorway. It seemed to occupy more of the room than the day before. By late morning, the apartment smelled different. It was subtle at first, a faint dampness that blended with the scent of cleaning supplies she used so religiously. But as the sun warmed the walls, a note of iron and earth began to rise from somewhere unseen. She sniffed near the sink, under the counter, behind the fridge, searching for a spilled rag or forgotten trash bag. Nothing. The smell didn't have a source. It was just there, part of the air. Around noon, she climbed back onto the stepladder with a flashlight. She pressed the light against the ceiling. The glow diffused through the white surface, revealing shifting shadows inside the curve. Her breath caught. It wasn't a single mass of liquid, she realized. It was granular. The beam picked up thousands of tiny shapes suspended in the murky depth, a constellation of specks that moved when she tapped the surface with the back of her hand. The whole dome seemed to tremble, then settle again, as though exhaling. For a long moment, she stood frozen, her mind searching for an explanation that made sense. Sediment from rusted pipes, dust, air bubbles. None of it fit the way those particles drifted, deliberate and slow. When she blinked, she saw the pattern again, like dark freckles scattered in gelatin. The image triggered a childhood memory, her grandmother's pond in summer, the water's surface covered in clusters of frog spawn. The same translucent beads, each with a black dot suspended in the center. She stepped down quickly, nearly missing a rung. Her knees felt weak. The smell thickened as the day wore on. It wasn't rotting, not yet, but heavy, sour, like soil after a flood. She opened a window, letting in the city noise she normally tried to keep out. Cars, voices, wind, all of it better than that oppressive quiet that seemed to gather beneath the bulge. The sound of her neighbor's television filtered faintly through the wall, an old sitcom laugh track that felt almost comforting. Still, when she looked back at the ceiling, she could swear it had grown again. That evening, she walked upstairs and knocked on her neighbor's door. The old man opened after a long minute, wearing an undershirt and slippers, confusion clouding his face. She explained politely that she thought there might be a leak coming from his apartment. He shook his head before she even finished. "No leaks here, miss," he said. "Pipes are fine. I don't even use the kitchen much." He gestured toward his spotless counter in the background, dry and bare. "Probably from the roof? These old buildings, you know." She thanked him, even though the logic didn't fit. The roof was 2 stories above them. She returned downstairs, feeling more alone than before. By the time she started dinner, the odor had become unbearable. She kept tasting metal every time she inhaled. She ate quickly, barely chewing, and spent the rest of the evening wiping the counters, sweeping, mopping, anything to distract herself. When she finally sat down, the fatigue hit her all at once. She leaned her elbows on the table and stared up at the distorted reflection of the light bulb in the ceiling. It looked like a warped, milky eye staring back. The radio played quietly on the counter, a weather report predicting rain for the weekend. The irony wasn't lost on her. She wondered if the moisture in the air would make it worse. On impulse, she got up and unplugged every appliance near the bulge. The kettle, the toaster, even the microwave. If water did come through, she wasn't going to risk electrocution. She found herself whispering, "Just in case," as though someone were there to argue. The hours stretched. Around midnight, she took another photo, comparing it with the first one she had taken 2 days earlier. The change was shocking. The dip now reached nearly to the top of her refrigerator. She marked the depth again with her thread, the small act of measurement giving her a fleeting illusion of control. When she looked at the string, though, she saw it trembling slightly. It took her a second to realize that it wasn't her hand causing it. The ceiling itself was moving, barely, rhythmically, as if something inside was expanding and contracting with breath. She dropped the thread and stepped back. Her rational mind immediately rebelled against the idea. Air pressure, vibrations from the pipes, anything but life. Yet the motion continued, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. Her stomach turned cold. She turned away, refusing to look any longer, and retreated to her bedroom. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building made her flinch. She dreamed of the pond again, of countless tiny eyes just beneath the surface of the water, watching from the shadows. When she woke near dawn, her heart was pounding. The apartment felt humid, the air thick. She walked to the kitchen on trembling legs. The bulge had descended another inch overnight. Its shape was perfect, smooth as glass, but darker now in the center. She could see faint streaks running down the inner surface, as though the material inside had begun to separate into layers. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound. The urge to run, to get out, warred with the need to understand. She grabbed her phone again and took a new series of photographs from different angles, each more grotesque than the last. She sent them all to the maintenance address, attaching a message. "The ceiling is expanding rapidly. The smell is worsening. Please send someone immediately." She hit send, though she doubted anyone would read it before business hours. For the next hour, she sat on the couch, staring at the doorway. The silence in the kitchen felt alive. She could almost hear a subtle squelching noise now, like thick liquid shifting within confined space. Every so often it was punctuated by a faint click, as if bubbles of air were rising through something viscous. She hugged her knees to her chest, counting the seconds between sounds. When the sun finally rose, light spilled across the bulging surface, revealing an oily sheen. She caught the glimmer of movement again, tiny shapes drifting, rearranging, merging. She told herself it had to be air pockets or sediment from a rusted pipe, anything mechanical. But no machine or plumbing fault could look like that, like thousands of minuscule organisms packed together behind a translucent membrane. Her phone buzzed with a text from the maintenance office. Technician scheduled between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. She laughed softly, the sound brittle. She wasn't sure the ceiling would last that long. The smell had invaded every corner of her apartment. She lit a candle, then another, but they only layered sweetness over decay. Even her clothes seemed to absorb the scent. She checked the clock again. 10 was still hours away. The idea of waiting under that thing made her skin crawl. She retreated to the hallway, pacing, but even from there she could hear the slow, wet noises from the kitchen. She thought of leaving, going to a cafe, but something in her refused to abandon the apartment. What if the ceiling collapsed while she was gone? What if the water destroyed her kitchen, or worse, caused a fire? It was foolish, maybe, but she couldn't leave. She stayed by the doorway, heart hammering, staring at the undulating shadow above. As the morning stretched on, she noticed new details. The outer edge of the bulge had grown faintly yellow, a sign of whatever fluid pressed against it. The smell now carried a tang of algae. She could feel the humidity rising, moisture condensing on the window glass. She took one last look and whispered, "Hold on." It was the first time she realized she was talking to her ceiling as though it could hear her. She turned away to fetch a towel, and in that brief moment the room gave a low, muffled pop, like a giant bubble adjusting its skin. She froze mid-step, afraid to breathe. The sound didn't repeat, but the silence afterward felt charged, as if the entire apartment were waiting for her next move. She backed slowly into the living room, her eyes fixed on that bulging white dome. The technician would come, she told herself. They would cut it open, drain whatever foul mixture hid inside, and everything would return to normal. She clung to that belief as if it were a lifeline. Yet, deep down, a quieter thought whispered that what was inside the ceiling might already be beyond control. By the time the clock ticked past 9, the curve of the ceiling cast a shadow that swallowed half the kitchen. It loomed there, heavy and patient, a silent threat she could neither escape nor confront. Vanessa sat by the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, listening to the low, intermittent creaks from above, the sound of pressure building, waiting for the inevitable moment when something would finally give. The technician never came that morning. Vanessa waited until noon, sitting in the living room with her shoes already on, her jacket laid across her knees, ready to open the door at the first sound of footsteps in the hallway. The message from the maintenance company had said between 10 and 4, but she had half hoped someone would take pity on the word urgent in her email and arrive early. The hours passed with the hollow, suspended quality of waiting for bad news. Every few minutes she caught herself listening, not to the ticking clock, but to the room beyond the doorway where the soft, viscous sounds came from the ceiling. By lunchtime the smell had worsened. It was no longer just damp or metallic, but layered, sour-sweet and organic, the way the air used to smell after rain in her grandmother's backyard when frogs crowded the ditches. The association made her skin crawl. She closed the kitchen door and tried to focus on work, but the apartment felt like it was shrinking, the walls holding the smell the same way the ceiling held whatever was inside it. Around 2 o'clock, she decided to stop waiting. If no one was coming, she would at least find out what she was dealing with. The thought of standing directly under that swollen thing terrified her, but curiosity, sharp, anxious curiosity, overpowered fear. She set up the stepladder again, climbed slowly, and held her flashlight close to the bulge. The light diffused through the thin white film, illuminating the inside like a lantern shade. What she saw this time made her mouth go dry. The entire cavity was filled with suspended particles, countless tiny beads floating in a cloudy fluid. Each one was nearly transparent, and in the center of each was a dark speck. The pattern was unmistakable. They weren't bits of rust, not dust or dirt or air. They were eggs. Millions of them packed together, undulating ever so slightly as the weight shifted above. She felt a chill run through her hands. The memory of summers spent near muddy ponds hit her so vividly that for a moment she swayed on the ladder. She could almost hear the trill of frogs at dusk, the slow, sticky sound of movement in shallow water. But this wasn't a field or a pond. This was her ceiling. 7 floors up, in the middle of a city. Vanessa climbed down and backed away until she hit the wall. Her mind raced to assemble something logical from the impossible. Frogs couldn't have gotten here. There was no soil, no water source, unless, the thought formed reluctantly, the pipes. The building's foundation was old, the kind of labyrinth where moisture and rot collected unseen. If water had risen in the basement after spring rains, if something living had found its way into the drainage lines, could it have reached this far? The idea felt absurd, yet the proof hung above her head, glistening under the light. She fetched her phone and snapped photo after photo. Each flash captured a sickly translucence, the tiny black dots forming constellations inside the white bubble. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred and sent the images in another email to the maintenance company with no subject line. Just the words, "This isn't water. Please come now." Then she stood in the center of the kitchen, phone in hand, realizing how powerless she was. The ceiling was breathing. Not literally, but it gave that impression. The bulge pulsed almost imperceptibly, like the slow rhythm of something alive. The film stretched and relaxed, as though pressure from within shifted back and forth. She imagined a living mass above her, the eggs slowly changing, multiplying, feeding on the stagnant water. Her rational mind tried to quiet the thought. It was ridiculous. They couldn't develop without oxygen or warmth. But dread had already taken over reason. She turned off the light and left the room, closing the door behind her. For the rest of the afternoon, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time she tried to work, she saw the images again in her mind. That glimmering sea of spheres, the dark centers like eyes. By sunset, she was shaking. She went upstairs once more to knock on the old man's door, hoping for conversation, for proof she wasn't losing her grip on reality. This time he didn't answer. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Perhaps he was asleep, or perhaps the apartment above was truly empty. She descended the stairs slowly, gripping the railing, listening to the hum of pipes in the walls. It wasn't a sound she had ever paid attention to before, but now it seemed to carry a faint rhythm, an irregular gurgling that traveled through the building like a heartbeat. When she reached her floor, she hesitated outside her own door. The air smelled stronger here. Inside, she flicked on the hall light and looked toward the kitchen. The door was closed, but a thin shadow pooled at the bottom, darker than before. She pressed her hand against the wood. It was faintly cool and slick with condensation. The realization that humidity was seeping through frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She stepped back, her chest tightening. If the ceiling gave way, the water would pour through everything: her cabinets, her outlets, her floor. She grabbed towels, sheets, anything absorbent, and lined the kitchen floor before daring to open the door again. The sight made her gasp. The bulge had grown, its lower curve now just above her head. It looked heavy enough to tear itself loose at any moment. Under the glare of the ceiling light, the interior shimmered faintly, a soft, gelatinous glow. The dark dots inside had multiplied, so dense that some areas appeared gray rather than translucent. She tried to think rationally, to anchor herself in facts. A broken drain, standing water, biological debris from the basement carried upward by pressure. But even as she listed those possibilities, another, less comfortable truth formed. She wasn't just looking at contamination. This was reproduction. Something alive had laid those eggs. The thought struck her with the same clarity as an electric shock. She stepped closer, phone still in hand, and aimed the camera again. The flash went off, and for a fraction of a second she thought she saw movement, a ripple, subtle but definite, passing across the entire surface like the flick of a shadow under water. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the phone. Her breath came shallow and fast. The smell grew unbearable now, filling her nose and throat with the sharp tang of organic decay. She coughed, turned away, and fled into the living room, opening every window she could reach. Cold air rushed in, scattering the staleness, but bringing with it the distant noise of traffic and the barking of dogs. She stood by the open window until her breathing steadied. When she turned back toward the kitchen, the door frame seemed darker, the air heavier. She could hear a faint plopping sound now, irregular but steady, as if drops of thick fluid were sliding within the ceiling and settling in one spot. She imagined the bulge shifting its internal weight, distributing pressure. Her mind supplied images she didn't want. The slow movement of embryos in a clutch, wriggling against the transparent walls of their prison. She forced herself to move. She unplugged the fridge and microwave, dragged them into the hall, wiped sweat from her forehead, though the apartment was cold. She could not stay here tonight, not with that thing above her. She packed an overnight bag, her hands trembling so badly that she dropped her keys twice. But as she reached for her coat, she hesitated. Leaving meant coming back to who knew what. The ceiling could burst while she was gone, flooding everything she owned. She needed proof, documentation, something to hold the building responsible. Vanessa set up her phone on the counter facing the bulge and started recording video. The faint hiss of the microphone picked up the squelch from above, the occasional popping noise that had begun minutes ago. She watched the timer on the screen tick upward. 1 minute, 2. The bulge remained still, though she could almost sense movement inside, slow and silent, beyond the camera's ability to see. She stopped recording after 5 minutes, saved the file, and emailed it to herself, attaching the previous photos. The act of recording steadied her a little. It made the situation concrete, something external rather than the fever of her imagination. She looked around her spotless kitchen, the clean tiles and arranged jars, and felt a wave of unreality. How could something so vile exist in a place so orderly? The ceiling looked swollen and alive, and she felt a strange pity mingling with fear, a pity for the unknown force that had found its way here, trapped in plaster and plastic, suffocating in its own creation. As evening deepened, she turned off the kitchen light to save electricity and left only the hallway lamp burning. In the dimness, the bulge glowed faintly, like a moon behind clouds. She stood there, transfixed, for what felt like an hour. The rhythmic creaks from above continued, steady as breathing. Her phone buzzed with a notification, another automated response from the maintenance office, confirming her ticket had been escalated. She laughed softly, bitterly. Escalated. The word felt absurdly polite for what was happening. Outside, rain began to fall, a soft patter against the window that merged with the dripping sounds in her mind. She thought about calling someone, her sister, a friend, but the idea of explaining that her ceiling was full of frog eggs felt impossible. They would think she'd imagined it. Maybe she had. Maybe it was all in her head. She almost wanted it to be. But the smell told her otherwise. No hallucination could reek like that, a damp, fertile rot that clung to everything it touched. She glanced at the ceiling one last time before leaving the room. The bulge seemed to quiver in the dim light, the surface flexing ever so slightly as though acknowledging her gaze. She turned away and closed the door gently, the latch clicking like a heartbeat in the silence. That night, she slept fitfully on the couch with her coat still on. Dreams came in fragments, muddy water, ripples spreading outward, eyes beneath the surface. Each time she woke, the sound from the kitchen was there again, faint but insistent, a slow, rhythmic shifting, as though something just above the plaster was growing, swelling, waiting for release. Morning brought no relief. Vanessa opened her eyes to a gray half-light, the kind of light that made everything look damp even when it wasn't. She sat up slowly, her neck stiff from sleeping on the couch, her mind fogged by broken dreams. For a moment, she didn't remember why she'd slept there instead of in her bed, and then the memory flooded back. The sagging ceiling, the smell, the impossible vision of millions of eggs shifting in a hidden sea above her head. The thought made her stomach tighten. She turned toward the kitchen door, still closed, and felt the same dread she used to feel before opening the door of a hospital room where she didn't know what she'd find inside. The air in the apartment had changed overnight. It was heavy, saturated with moisture. Her windows were slick with condensation, beads of water running down the glass like sweat. She stood and walked barefoot to the bathroom to splash cold water on her face, but even there she could smell it now, the wet mineral odor that reminded her of swamps and standing rainwater. She turned the tap to rinse her mouth, and for an instant she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the mirror behind her, some subtle vibration in the wall. When she turned, nothing was there. Just the same quiet space, the same muffled silence that had begun to feel hostile. She made coffee by habit, the routine an anchor against panic. The act of measuring grounds, of listening to the drip and hiss, gave her a few steady minutes. When she carried the cup to the living room, she could hear faint sounds through the kitchen door. Not loud, not even distinct, just a gentle, wet creak, the same way an old sponge sounds when you squeeze it. She told herself that water must be leaking from the ceiling cavity into the insulation. She could almost believe it until she caught the smell again. It wasn't only water anymore. There was a sourness that made her eyes sting, a living, organic sharpness like rotting leaves. By 9 o'clock, she had decided she couldn't wait any longer for help. She checked the maintenance app on her phone. The ticket still showed no technician assigned. Her hands trembled as she typed a new message. "The ceiling is going to break. Please send someone today." She didn't expect an answer. After she hit send, she stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then dropped the phone onto the couch and walked toward the kitchen. The door handle was damp under her fingers. When she pushed it open, the first thing that hit her was the smell. Dense, fetid, clinging to her throat like smoke. It was stronger now, multiplied, with an undertone of something chemical, as though the ceiling itself were fermenting. The light fixture in the center of the bulge was still intact, but its glass shade was smeared from inside with a pale stain. She switched it on, and the sight made her breath catch. The bulge had grown again, and its color had deepened. The once white surface now carried a faint yellow-gray tint, the tone of old parchment. Within the curvature, she could see faint, darker streaks, like veins beneath translucent skin. For a long minute, she could only stare. The bulge seemed to pulse slightly, almost like the rhythm of slow breathing. Maybe it was just air pressure or the building settling, but it felt alive, too deliberate to be random. She remembered the photos she had taken yesterday and decided she needed one more. She stepped carefully onto the stepladder again, her legs unsteady. The smell thickened as she rose closer to the ceiling. She could hear it now, tiny sounds, faint but unmistakable, as if 1,000 small bodies shifted within a confined space. Her hands began to shake. The flashlight beam revealed what the kitchen light had hidden. The eggs had changed. The once clear spheres were now cloudy, the black centers larger, more defined. She realized with cold clarity that something was developing inside them. She jerked back instinctively, hitting her shoulder against the refrigerator. The impact jolted her, but she barely felt it. She was staring upward, unable to look away from the slow, undulating mass. It took every ounce of will not to run. Instead, she backed out of the room, shut the door, and leaned against it, pressing her palms flat against the cool wood. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. The thought of those eggs, growing in her ceiling, made her want to scream. But she forced herself to think, to move. She had to contain the damage before it got worse. She spent the next half hour dragging everything electrical out of the kitchen. The coffee maker, the toaster, even the extension cord that powered her microwave. She unplugged them all and stacked them in the hallway. The floor was slick under her feet. Condensation had begun to gather in corners, small puddles reflecting light like dull mirrors. Every few minutes she heard a new sound, a muffled pop, a soft slosh, a faint creak of the ceiling stretching tighter. Each sound made her flinch. When she looked again, she noticed faint droplets forming on the lowest point of the bulge, trembling with each vibration. They caught the light like pearls before falling silently to the floor. The first time it happened, she felt a surge of panic, expecting a torrent, but only a few drops followed. She grabbed a towel and wiped them away, her heart hammering. The liquid left a faint film on her skin, not quite oily but not clean either, and when she rinsed it under the tap, the smell clung stubbornly. The air in the apartment had grown almost unbreathable. She opened every window, letting the cold spring wind rush through. Curtains fluttered violently, scattering papers and the faint, sickly odor that had soaked into her furniture. She stood for a long moment in the draft, letting the chill bite her cheeks, until her pulse slowed. But even then, beneath the sounds of the city outside, she could hear the ceiling groan again, louder now. Desperation drove her back to the door. She would puncture it, release the pressure before it burst on its own. It was dangerous, yes, but less dangerous than waiting for disaster. She found a pair of gloves and an old knife from her toolbox, its edge dull but sturdy. Standing at the threshold, she hesitated. The silence on the other side felt thick, almost physical. Then she stepped inside, climbed the ladder once more, and pressed the tip of the knife against the lowest point of the bulge. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a sound came from within, faint and liquid, a slow shudder, like 1,000 grains shifting in a sack. The movement was unmistakable. The entire surface trembled under her hand. She froze, paralyzed by the visceral knowledge that something inside had responded to her touch. The handle of the knife slipped in her sweating palm. Her brain screamed at her to move, to get out, but her body refused to obey. Only when another ripple passed across the bulge did she stumble back, nearly toppling the ladder. She fled the room, slamming the door behind her, the knife clattering to the floor. She stood in the hallway gasping, her back pressed to the opposite wall. A few seconds later she heard it again, a wet, heavy sound, followed by a faint hissing, as if air were escaping in tiny bursts. The smell grew stronger even out here, spreading through the apartment like smoke. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her so badly she almost screamed. It was a text from the maintenance office. Technician delayed. Will reschedule for tomorrow morning. The message blurred as tears filled her eyes. Tomorrow. They had no idea what was happening here. She typed furiously, her fingers shaking. You don't understand. It's going to burst. The smell is toxic. Please, I need help today. She hit send, but knew it wouldn't change anything. The rest of the day dissolved into nervous waiting. She sat by the open window, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the low noises coming from behind the kitchen door. Sometimes they stopped for long stretches, lulling her into thinking it was over, only to start again. Slow creaks, faint dripping, the sound of a strained surface ready to give way. She couldn't eat. She couldn't read. Every part of her awareness was focused on that one door. As the sun went down, shadows thickened in the apartment, and her fear changed shape. It was no longer sharp, but dull and constant, like a fever. The ceiling would burst eventually. She could feel it. It was only a matter of when. She considered going to a hotel, but the thought of leaving her apartment alone with that thing made her stomach twist. What if it broke while she was gone and destroyed everything? What if it seeped through the walls and infected the whole building? The idea was absurd, but she couldn't shake it. She stayed awake long after midnight, every nerve tuned to the sounds of the kitchen. Around 3, she heard something new, a slow, rhythmic tapping, soft but distinct, as though drops of thick liquid were falling onto plastic. She crept to the door, barely breathing, and pressed her ear to it. The sound came from just beyond, slow and deliberate. Tap. Pause. Tap. Each impact slightly heavier than the last. The smell leaking through the crack in the door was so strong it burned her throat. She turned away, retreating down the hall, trying not to imagine what was happening inside. But imagination filled the void easily enough. She saw the ceiling bulging further, the membrane thinning until light shone through, the eggs shifting and swirling in the stagnant water. She saw them falling, bursting open as they hit the tiles, coating everything in a living film. She pressed her fist to her temples and tried to stop the image, but it lingered behind her eyelids like an afterimage of light. She must have dozed off near dawn, curled on the couch under her blanket. When she woke, a thin line of sunlight cut across the floor, illuminating tiny droplets of moisture hanging in the air. For a moment, she thought it was just condensation from the open windows, but then she saw the faint shimmer of movement within them, tiny motes drifting like dust. She blinked and they were gone. The smell, though, was worse than ever. She could taste it now, an acrid bitterness that coated her tongue. The kitchen door made a faint creak as the building shifted. She turned her head toward it and watched as the doorknob glistened in the morning light, a bead of moisture running down its curve. The realization came with a shiver. The condensation was spreading outward from the kitchen, reaching into the rest of her apartment. The air itself seemed saturated with the presence of what lay beyond that door. Vanessa stood motionless for a long time, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She could hear faint trickling sounds again, the sigh of air escaping, the almost imperceptible thrum of water under pressure. She thought about the eggs, about what they would become if left undisturbed. And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, she understood that she had lost control entirely. She wasn't waiting for the ceiling to collapse anymore. It was waiting for her. It happened just after 5 a.m, as the first weak threads of light filtered through the half-closed blinds in Vanessa's living room. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were dry, her limbs stiff from hours curled in the same position beneath the blanket. At some point, she had stopped tracking the minutes, drifting in and out of a waking stupor, too exhausted to remain alert, too frightened to rest. The air was dense with the now familiar odor, moist, organic, and oddly metallic. She had stopped trying to push it away. It was in the fabric of the curtains, in the cushions, in her hair. Even the rain outside hadn't helped. It had only deepened the saturation, as though the building itself was beginning to rot from the inside. The first sound was quiet, a faint snap like the brittle edge of plastic splitting beneath weight. Vanessa sat bolt upright, eyes wide, heart already thudding in her chest before her brain fully registered what she'd heard. A second passed. Then another noise, deeper this time. A slow, wet tearing, like fabric soaked in oil being pulled apart. She was already on her feet when the real sound came. It was not loud in the traditional sense, not an explosion or a shatter, but it filled the apartment completely. A low, thunderous groan that vibrated in the walls, the floor, even her bones. It was the sound of something giving way, something massive and swollen finally surrendering to gravity. She didn't have to open the kitchen door to know what had happened. She could hear it. Thick slaps of fluid hitting tile, the chaotic splash of liquid against cabinets and appliances, the hollow gurgle of water seeking the lowest place. Then the smell hit her full force. It wasn't a smell anymore. It was a presence, a cloying, wet thing that wrapped around her like fog. Her knees buckled. She stumbled backward and covered her nose with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, gagging as bile rose to her throat. Every instinct screamed to run, to escape the building entirely, but her body betrayed her. She stood frozen, trembling, eyes locked on the kitchen door as if expecting it to burst open and release whatever was inside. After several long seconds, she moved. Not away, but forward. Her fingers closed around the doorknob slick with condensation and turned. The door creaked open an inch, then another. A wave of heat and moisture rolled out, thick as steam. She pushed the door the rest of the way and stepped into the room. The floor was underwater. A thin layer of opaque, yellow-brown liquid covered every surface, rippling gently, as if alive. The overhead light flickered, casting warped shadows across the walls. and then she saw them. At first, it looked like foam, clusters of translucent bubbles scattered across the tile, quivering in the shallow water. But as she stepped closer, she realized they weren't floating. They clung to the floor in clumps, their gelatinous bodies swelling and contracting with minute motion. The same spheres she had seen suspended in the ceiling were now spread across her kitchen like a carpet of glistening seed. Some were broken, their contents spilled into the water as a milky fluid. Others remained intact, dark specks pulsing inside their transparent shells. She couldn't breathe. She backed away, slipping on the wet floor and catching herself on the doorframe. The motion sent ripples across the surface, disturbing the clusters of eggs. Several shifted in response, the black dots inside twitching as though agitated by the vibration. Her skin crawled. In the corner, under the sink, a slow stream of fluid still dripped from the ruptured ceiling. Above, the glossy white surface had collapsed into tatters. Ribbons of torn material hung down like skin peeled away, revealing the dark cavity behind it. The insulation was soaked, sagging, black with moisture. Bits of debris clung to the strands, twigs, mud, even a fragment of a plastic bag. She stared up into that gaping wound and saw what looked like the remnants of soil, as if the ceiling had been holding part of a forest floor inside it. A single drop fell and landed on her bare foot. The sensation broke the spell. She stumbled back into the hallway, breathing hard, and slammed the kitchen door shut behind her. She pressed her back against it, heart racing, the weight of adrenaline in her chest like a lead ball. She had seen enough. More than enough. Her phone was still on the couch. She grabbed it and called the emergency line for building maintenance, her fingers slipping on the screen. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. She called 311. The automated voice put her in a queue. She hung up. Her hands were shaking too much to type, but she managed to open the email app and fire off another message to the maintenance contact, this time attaching a new video she had taken. Just 10 seconds of the scene in her kitchen, but enough to make her nauseous. Then she went to the bathroom, locked the door, and threw up. It took her nearly half an hour to calm down. She sat on the floor, head against the cool tile, knees drawn up to her chest. She could hear it still, behind the walls, beneath the floor, a slow, steady dripping that no longer sounded like water, but like something heavier, thicker. She thought of the mass inside the ceiling, of the way the eggs had responded to her presence, and a new fear began to bloom. What if it wasn't just passive reproduction? What if it was migration? She stood and splashed cold water on her face. Her reflection looked foreign, sunken cheeks, bloodshot eyes, damp hair plastered to her temples. She rinsed her mouth and made a decision. She couldn't stay here. She had to leave. But not without doing something first. She returned to the hallway, gathered towels, blankets, anything absorbent, and began to build a makeshift barrier around the kitchen door. The fluid was already seeping out beneath the frame. She pressed the layers down, trying to contain it. The smell oozed through anyway, but at least she could slow the spread. Then she pulled out a roll of duct tape and sealed the edges of the doorframe as best she could, pressing it down with trembling hands. She didn't know how long it would hold, but it was something. After she was done, she walked to the window and opened it fully. The cold wind rushed in, slapping her face, clearing her lungs. Below, the street was quiet. A few early risers walked dogs or jogged, oblivious to the biological disaster unfolding 7 stories above them. She considered yelling, waving someone down, but the shame stopped her. How would she even explain it? What would she say? She packed a bag with the essentials, wallet, keys, phone charger, clean clothes, and left the apartment. The hallway outside was still. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. She hesitated only once, looking back at her door, then turned and walked quickly down the stairs. She didn't take the elevator. She didn't trust anything mechanical in that building anymore. At the front desk, there was no one. The night guard must have gone off shift, or maybe he was sleeping somewhere in the back. She considered leaving a note, but didn't bother. What could she write that would make sense? Outside, the morning was crisp and wet. Puddles reflected the sky, low and heavy with clouds. She crossed the street and sat on a bench near the bus stop, trying to steady her thoughts. She felt detached from her body, as if watching someone else perform these actions. The images from her kitchen replayed in her mind over and over. The shredded ceiling, the eggs pulsing on the floor, the water, the smell. After a few minutes, she pulled out her phone and checked the video again. It was worse than she remembered. The sound alone made her skin crawl. She tapped the screen to pause it and noticed something she hadn't before. In the corner of the frame near the base of the sink, one of the eggs was no longer whole. Its outer membrane had ruptured, and a thin, dark shape was emerging from it. A twitching, tail-like motion barely visible in the fluid. She stared at it, numb. The first one had hatched. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She considered calling someone. 911, a pest control service, the city health department, but she didn't know what to say. What was the emergency? A ceiling collapse? Contamination? Frogs? The words sounded ridiculous even in her mind. She was alone with this, at least for now. The rest of the day passed in fragments. She checked into a cheap hotel near the highway, the kind of place that smelled like bleach and had a television bolted to the wall. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the egg break open again. She wondered how many had hatched by now. 10? 100? All of them? At sunset, she received a message from the maintenance office. A technician had arrived and documented a significant ceiling rupture in her unit. The apartment had been temporarily sealed for safety, pending a full evaluation. She stared at the words for a long time. No mention of eggs. No mention of contamination. Just damage, rupture, safety. She didn't reply. She didn't go back, but as darkness settled outside a window of her hotel room, she sat on the edge of the bed, her bag beside her, her phone in hand. The video was still open, frozen on the frame of the ruptured egg. She stared at it in silence, her breath shallow. Somewhere in the city, inside a sealed apartment on the 7th floor, a new ecosystem was being born, and she had been its first witness. 2 days passed before Vanessa received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. She was sitting in the far corner of the hotel lounge, cradling a lukewarm cup of coffee in both hands, her clothes stiff with overuse and the perpetual smell of chemical air freshener seeping from the hallway. She hadn't slept through the night since the rupture. Each time she closed her eyes, her body jolted itself awake, as if refusing to let her forget what she had seen. The call came in silently. She felt the vibration in her pocket and answered without checking who it was, more out of reflex than interest. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, official. A man introducing himself as Mr. Sandoval, a representative from the building's property management firm. He apologized for the inconvenience, then stated in precise terms that the ceiling in Unit 7C had suffered an unexpected failure, and that after assessment by the emergency response team, the unit had been secured and isolated for biohazard investigation. Vanessa sat up straighter. He asked if she would be willing to return to the premises to meet with representatives from the cleanup and structural integrity services. She hesitated, a reflexive tightening in her throat, making it hard to respond. When she didn't speak, he continued, explaining that they were required to conduct a formal report due to the nature of the incident. The term he used, unusual organic mass introduced via compromised infrastructure, sounded both ludicrous and chilling. She agreed to meet them the following morning, unable to imagine what would await her in the place she no longer considered home. She returned to the apartment just after 9, accompanied by a man in coveralls and a respirator who introduced himself only as Eric. He handed her a paper mask, insisted she wear it, and warned her to avoid touching any surfaces. The door to her unit had been sealed with industrial plastic, stretched tight and stapled into the wooden frame like the barrier on a quarantine lab. Eric pulled it open with a gloved hand, releasing a gust of stale, humid air that still carried the same bitter tang she had tried to forget. Inside, the scene looked almost surgical. Her belongings had been pushed to the sides, covered in tarps or plastic sheeting. The ceiling was gone entirely now. No remnants of the white membrane or light fixture. The cavity above had been exposed fully, revealing dark, wet beams and a gaping pipe that looked decades old. The room had been stripped of electricity. The only illumination came from a large portable light that cast stark shadows against the glistening floor. The eggs were gone, or at least she thought they were. The water had been pumped out, the tiles scrubbed and bleached, but where the mass had lain, a large section of the floor remained discolored, stained a faint yellow that no amount of cleaning could erase. A group of men in uniforms stood near the sink, one of them holding a clipboard. They nodded politely when she entered, but their eyes betrayed discomfort. None of them seemed eager to be the one to speak. Finally, a younger man with thin glasses and a badge reading H. Lynn, Biohaz Response, cleared his throat and gestured for her attention. He explained, in the slow, deliberate cadence of someone used to giving bad news in technical language, that the building's plumbing system had suffered a long-standing failure in vertical containment. A combination of blocked drains, back pressure, and structural deterioration had created a hidden cavity above her ceiling that had slowly filled with water over the past several months. Vanessa listened without interrupting. She knew all this already, or at least she had guessed at the shape of it. What she hadn't known, and what Lynn now confirmed, was that the water had come from the building's substructure, specifically the maintenance sub-basement, an area beneath the first level that had been sealed decades ago due to flooding. According to him, a forgotten runoff chamber had become a stagnant pool, fed by intermittent leaks and rainwater seeping through the crumbling foundation. In that darkness and warmth, a self-contained ecosystem had emerged. The term he used was accidental breeding ground. Lynn described in vague but carefully chosen words that amphibians, most likely common tree frogs, had somehow reached the sub-basement. Whether they had entered through the sewer lines, storm drains, or ventilation shafts, no one knew for certain. But they had found water, stillness, safety, and when the water level rose high enough to force its way up through the plumbing, it carried with it not just filth, but generations of spawn. The man with the clipboard added that the volume of biological material was unlike anything they had seen in an urban environment. Not just a few isolated eggs, but a massive gelatinous colony, millions of them, cohesive, concentrated, and suspended in fluid thick enough to prevent immediate drainage. When the pipe behind Vanessa's ceiling began to fail, it created a false chamber, a pocket of warmth and moisture ideal for gestation. That was what had gathered above her head. That was what had burst. Vanessa asked only one question: were they alive? Lynn hesitated before answering. Some of them, yes. When the ceiling gave way, the sudden drop in temperature and light had killed most of the eggs, but not all. A few had reached late-stage development. They found 3 live specimens on the kitchen floor. Tiny, black-skinned tadpoles, each barely the size of a fingernail. They had been collected and sent to a laboratory for species verification and environmental risk assessment. None had yet transformed into juvenile frogs, but the potential was present. She stood in silence for a long time, her eyes fixed on the stain in the tile. It didn't look like much, just a faint discoloration, a subtle reminder. But she knew better. That stain marked the edge of an ecosystem. A hidden world had flourished there, unseen, unknown, until it broke through the surface and spilled into hers. And she had been standing beneath it for days. Later that day, she met with an adjuster from the insurance company. A woman in a crisp blazer with a tablet and a practiced smile, she walked through the apartment taking photographs and muttering assessments under her breath. Vanessa followed her, numb to the process. The woman asked questions she barely heard, about the damage to the cabinets, the ruined appliances, the floor warping near the hallway. Vanessa answered in a monotone, repeating the same details she had already written in emails. The adjuster nodded, typed notes, and promised a follow-up. But when Vanessa mentioned the eggs, the smell, the moment of rupture, the woman stiffened slightly. She listened, but her expression shifted, more analytical, less empathetic. Biological contamination wasn't in her standard forms. She'd have to escalate it, she said. Vanessa nodded, expecting nothing. The following morning, a specialist from the Environmental Health Division arrived. He wore a black vest and carried equipment that looked more suited for a chemical spill than a city apartment. He moved with slow, methodical precision, taking air samples, scraping residue from the floor, scanning the walls for mold. He said little. At the end, he handed her a printed notice. Due to elevated spore counts and chemical traces consistent with amphibian reproductive matter, the apartment would be deemed temporarily uninhabitable. She would be provided temporary housing compensation for up to 14 days, pending remediation. She didn't respond. She simply signed the paper and returned to the hotel. But the knowledge gnawed at her. The longer she stayed away, the more she thought about the building's foundation, the sealed-off sub-basement, the forgotten rain chambers, the warmth and dark that had given birth to so many lives. The report had described it clinically, but she could picture it too clearly. Mud, standing water, shadows stretching in every direction, the air heavy with damp decay, and somewhere within it, frogs, dozens, maybe hundreds, breeding in silence. And now they knew the way up. The next time she visited the building, it was not her apartment she approached. She asked the superintendent if she could see the basement. He blinked, confused, then shrugged. No one ever asked about it. He fetched the key and led her down past the mailroom, past the bike racks and broken vending machines, to a door marked with flaking paint and a rusted sign that said, "Authorized personnel only." He unlocked it and flicked on the light. A narrow stairwell led down into shadow. The smell met her halfway, earthy, metallic, and unmistakable. The hallway below was concrete, the walls stained with time, the ceiling low enough to brush her head. Pools of water clung to the edges. Further ahead, a heavy grate sealed off a chamber with bars welded over it. The superintendent waved his hand vaguely. "Flooded years ago," he said. "No one goes in. Nothing down there but rot and bugs. She stepped closer, peering through the bars. The room beyond was dark, but her eyes adjusted. She saw glimmers of water, still and opaque, debris floating near the surface, and then movement, a faint ripple, a small, delicate splash. She said nothing, only nodded and turned away. That night, she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her hotel room, clean and flat and silent, and imagined the pipes behind it, the hidden channels, the places that connected everything. And she knew, deep in her bones, that the rupture in her kitchen had not been the end. It had been a warning, a pressure release, and something below was still growing. It would be weeks before the apartment was cleared for re-entry. By then, she had already made her decision. She signed the paperwork, accepted the insurance payout, and declined the option to renew her lease. Her boxes were packed by a company she never met, delivered to a new address she hadn't yet furnished. She moved in quietly, without ceremony. The new place was on the second floor of a newer building, one with well-documented infrastructure, clean walls, and a staff that answered emails within hours, not days. But on her first morning there, she noticed a small sound in the bathroom. Just a faint gurgle from the sink. A tiny, harmless noise. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but she did. She leaned closer, and for a second she imagined she smelled something, distant, damp, and full of memory. She turned off the light, closed the door, and stepped away. Vanessa awoke to the pale light of morning filtering through the curtains of her new apartment. The space was quiet in a way that almost seemed unnatural after the chaos of the last week. The walls were freshly painted, the floors gleamed under a thin layer of polish, and the faint smell of antiseptic lingered, a sterile reminder that this place had been cleaned meticulously before she arrived. She sat up in bed, listening, half expecting to hear the faint gurgle of water, the squelch of the gelatinous mass, or some subtle shift from above. But there was nothing. The silence was absolute. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that the previous events had left a shadow in the air, an almost imperceptible residue of fear and wonder. Even so, she forced herself to move. The morning ritual, coffee, a quick shower, dressing, was a deliberate attempt to reclaim normality. She brewed her coffee carefully, savoring the steam as it curled in lazy loops toward the ceiling. Every sip was measured, deliberate, as though she could insulate herself from the memory of what had occurred. Despite the calm, her eyes kept flicking toward the ceiling, trained to seek out irregularities, to anticipate danger. She half expected to see a bulge forming, to witness the aftermath of some hidden biological process she didn't yet understand. But there was nothing. The flat, white surface above her kitchen was unbroken, ordinary, and completely silent. In the following days, Vanessa settled into a tentative routine, one built around hypervigilance and precaution. She inspected every corner of the apartment, ran her fingers along the edges of tiles, opened cupboards and cabinets to check for moisture, and tested faucets and drains for hidden leaks. Each action was methodical, almost ritualistic, a manifestation of her need to assert control in a world that had demonstrated unmistakably that it could overwhelm her. The memory of the ruptured ceiling, of the millions of eggs pulsing in the shallow water, refused to fade. At night, she often replayed the images, the translucent spheres glistening on her kitchen floor, the black dots moving within them, the slow, inevitable expansion of the bulge as it threatened to release its contents. She found herself compelled to document. Her phone, previously abandoned in a frenzy of panic and flight, became her instrument of recording and measurement. She photographed corners, tiles, and plumbing fixtures in meticulous detail, She kept notes on every anomaly she found. A faint stain here, a tiny drip there, the slightest irregularity and condensation on a window pane. Each entry was a way to reassert authority over her environment, to render tangible what had once seemed incomprehensible. Despite these measures, the psychological weight of the experience remained. Vanessa felt it in the quiet moments between tasks, when the apartment was most still, when her mind wandered toward memories she had not fully processed. She imagined the sub-basement of her former building, the stagnant water pooling in darkness, the shadows of the eggs clustered together in impossible density, the slow rise of that water into her apartment. She could still see the way the ceiling had swelled, as if in anticipation of release, and hear the subtle squelches and creaks that had filled her nights with fear. It had been a small, contained catastrophe in the grand scale of the city, and yet it had left her profoundly altered. One afternoon, she returned to the scene of the rupture, not the original apartment, which she had no intention of entering again, but mentally, with deliberate attention. She mapped out the sequence of events in her mind. The sub-basement flooded over months, the eggs laid in secrecy, the gradual buildup of pressure, the catastrophic rupture, the washing away of life into her kitchen floor. The realization that an ecosystem had existed, hidden above her head, yet entirely dependent on the failings of the building's infrastructure, unsettled her deeply. It was a reminder of the invisible processes that went unnoticed in the world around her: decay, growth, and the quiet persistence of life in the most improbable places. Her thoughts inevitably turned to responsibility. She had been a witness, a caretaker, albeit unwilling, to this small proliferation of life. She had documented, observed, and fled, leaving the remediation to others. Yet a part of her understood that she had altered the trajectory of those organisms simply by existing in that space. She had interacted with them, however indirectly. They had been displaced and yet survived through human intervention. That duality, the fragile coexistence of human negligence and biological resilience, haunted her. In her new apartment, she found herself drawn to the sink, the pipes, the small patches of damp that might gather unnoticed. She tested water flow, monitored humidity, and double-checked seals around fixtures. It was an obsessive diligence, born of necessity, but it also served as a ritual of absolution. She was asserting control over her environment, a way to manage the lingering anxiety from what she had endured. Every drip she caught, every small anomaly she corrected, was a reassurance. She could prevent another catastrophe. She could guard against the unseen. Despite her precautions, the memory of the rupture remained vivid, sharpened by the senses. She could recall the sound of the ceiling giving way, the smell of stagnant water mixed with earth and decay, the wet splashes that coated her kitchen floor. She could see the eggs, translucent and glistening, each with its black dot moving slowly, stubbornly, persistently. That image replayed in her mind with a clarity that no amount of distance or new surroundings could erase. It was a memory etched into the deepest part of her perception, a reminder of how fragile order could be and how quickly it could be overturned. The incident also altered her perception of other spaces. Walking through the city, she noticed storm drains with renewed attention, darkened alleyways where water collected, even neglected basement windows that might conceal moisture or mold. Every space held the potential for hidden life, for consequences unseen. She realized that her former apartment had been a microcosm of a larger reality, infrastructure failing, biological processes continuing unnoticed, human perception blind to the quiet persistence of organisms in the interstices of the city. At night, the vividness of her memories intensified. She often lay awake on her new bed, listening for sounds that weren't there: the faint drip of a distant pipe, the subtle creak of a floorboard settling, the imagined squelch of gelatinous masses beneath tiles. Her dreams were similarly vivid, populated with visions of eggs clustered in water, of ceilings bulging and ready to rupture, of tiny tadpoles emerging into unfamiliar, sterile spaces. She would wake with a start, her heart racing. The images burned into her mind with the same clarity as the actual event. Despite the terror, there was a strange, unnameable awe that lingered. The sight of life persisting in such improbable circumstances, thriving above her head for months without detection, inspired a mixture of wonder and dread. She understood, in a new and profound way, the resilience of living systems and the complexity of ecological processes. And yet, she also knew how easily they could be disrupted, how precarious the balance between life and destruction truly was. Over the following weeks, Vanessa continued to monitor her new apartment meticulously. She set up hygrometers, ran frequent inspections, and reinforced the areas most vulnerable to moisture. The rituals of observation became both a coping mechanism and a safeguard. Each time she detected a minor anomaly, she acted immediately, correcting it before it could escalate. She was vigilant, not out of paranoia, but out of a hard-earned respect for the fragility of the environment around her. She also began to write, documenting everything, not for anyone else, but for herself. She cataloged the events of the rupture, the responses of the maintenance and environmental teams, her own reactions, and the small details that had seemed inconsequential at the time. The exact odor of the water, the pattern of the eggs, the sound of the ceiling straining. Writing became a way to process the trauma, to structure the memory, and to ensure that nothing was forgotten. Every detail was preserved, every observation recorded with meticulous care. Months later, the incident had faded in immediate intensity, but remained vivid in Vanessa's consciousness. The apartment above her old unit had been repaired, the sub-basement drained and treated, but she knew the building itself retained the scars of neglect. And she knew that in other places, similar processes continued unnoticed. Her experience had changed the way she viewed her surroundings. No space was truly empty, no environment entirely inert, and no failure entirely inconsequential. Her daily routine resumed its rhythm, but it carried a new weight. She moved through her apartment with awareness, noting temperature, moisture, and sound. She measured, recorded, and corrected. The kitchen, now pristine and safe, became a site of vigilance rather than mere sustenance. Every faucet and drain was inspected before use. Every small sound or anomaly was noted. She had become, in a sense, a custodian of both her own environment and the unseen forces that might inhabit it. One evening, as she prepared dinner, she paused to look at the ceiling. It was perfectly flat and white, unbroken and ordinary, yet she could feel the memory of what had been, the mass that had grown and ruptured, the millions of eggs and their slow, inexorable development. The realization filled her with both relief and unease. The immediate danger was gone, but the lessons remained. Life found a way, often where it should not, and its persistence demanded respect. She finished cooking and carried her plate to the table, the evening light spilling over the countertop. She ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite while her mind continued to wander through the events she had endured. For the first time since the rupture, she felt a semblance of closure. She had survived. She had observed, documented, and ultimately escaped. The building, the ceiling, and the subterranean ecosystem had tested her in ways she would never forget. Yet, even as she washed the dishes afterward and dried them with care, she glanced once at the ceiling. There was nothing to see, nothing moving, nothing swelling, and still she could not shake the feeling that the world had expanded for her in that small, terrifying incident. She understood now that the ordinary was never truly empty, that hidden processes existed everywhere, and that the line between control and chaos was thin, delicate, and easily crossed. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and accepted that while the visitors were gone, the impact of their presence would remain with her forever. A quiet, unyielding awareness that life was everywhere, even in places no one looked, and that the boundaries of her reality had irrevocably changed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next unbelievable tale. Check out our other videos for more shocking discoveries and mind-blowing mysteries that you won't believe are real. Don't forget to share this video with friends who love suspense and strange true stories. They'll thank you for it.